Hello, everyone. Welcome to Untold Story, the channel where we explore the most shocking and often lesser-known episodes in history. Today we immerse ourselves in the expedition of the frigate Medusa, a tragic episode that occurred in 1816 that became one of the most shameful scandals of the period of the Bourbon Restoration in France and that left an indelible mark on the history of maritime exploration. The story begins in the context of the Bourbon Restoration in France following the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1815. After the Napoleonic Wars, France was in a state of political and social instability, and King Louis XVIII, who had been restored to the throne, was trying to restore the monarchy and the prestige of the country. In this context, the French government decided to send an expedition to Senegal with the aim of reasserting control over the territory, which had been temporarily ceded to the British after Napoleon's defeat. The frigate Medusa was selected to lead this expedition. The ship, a warship of the French Royal Navy, was under the command of Captain Hugues Duroy de Chaumareys, a nobleman who had spent many years in exile during the Napoleonic period and who, like many other royalists, had been restored to his military post after Napoleon's fall. However, despite his rank, he had no experience in offshore navigation and was completely incompetent to command an expedition of such magnitude. The expedition convoy, consisting of several ships, set sail from France in June 1816 with the mission of reaching the coast of Senegal. The frigate Medusa was carrying more than 400 people, including soldiers, settlers, and government officials, as well as their families. Among them was the governor-designate for Senegal, Julian Schmaltz, and his wife, underscoring the importance of the mission. From the beginning of the voyage, the expedition was marked by the captain's incompetence and poor decision-making. Ignoring the advice of his more experienced officers, he decided to follow a dangerous route near the African coast, which increased the risk of colliding with the sandbanks. On July 2, 1816, the frigate Medusa ran aground on the banks of Argan, off the coast of present-day Mauritania, being irretrievably stranded in shallow waters. The situation on board quickly deteriorated. Realizing that it was impossible to free the frigate, the decision was made to abandon ship. Makeshift rafts were built and lifeboats were assigned to transport passengers and crew to shore. However, the number of boats was insufficient for all the passengers, and while the elites and officers took the safest ones, about 147 people, mostly soldiers, crew, and lower-ranking passengers, were abandoned aboard a makeshift raft, hastily made from the ship's available materials. The raft, about 20 meters long and barely stable in the water, was overcrowded and had only limited provisions. Initially, the ships with the officers, including Captain Chaumareys, promised to tow the raft to shore, but within hours, the ships cut the ropes and left the raft adrift in the Atlantic, condemning its occupants to their fate. This act of betrayal and abandonment was just the beginning of one of the most tragic and brutal survival stories of the 19th century. Over the next 13 days, the castaways on the raft suffered a series of unspeakable horrors. Overcrowding, lack of food and drinking water, sweltering heat, and disorder on board led to total chaos. Within days, violent clashes began between the raft's occupants over scarce provisions, resulting in murders and the death of many of the passengers from hunger and thirst. By the fourth day, the provisions were completely depleted, leading the survivors to resort to feeding on their deceased comrades. Survivors described a nightmare scenario, with men fighting for their survival in an environment where humanity seemed to have completely vanished. Of the 147 men who originally boarded the raft, only 15 survived to be rescued. Meanwhile, the ships with the officers and elites of the expedition managed to reach the coast, although their journey was not without difficulties either. Upon arriving in Senegal, officers sent a rescue mission to find the raft, but when it was finally located, the scene they found was gruesome. The remaining 15 survivors were emaciated, dehydrated, and on the verge of insanity. The scandal of the frigate Medusa soon reached France and caused a great commotion in public opinion. The French press, particularly liberal newspapers, used the tragedy to attack Louis XVIII's government and the monarchists, highlighting the incompetence of Captain Chaumares as an example of the corruption and decay of the Bourbon Restoration. Survivors of the tragedy, including Alexander Carrerd and Jean-Baptiste Savigny, published a detailed account of what happened on the raft, which became a bestseller across Europe. His account exposed not only the suffering of the survivors, but also the injustice and negligence of the authorities responsible for the expedition. One of the most enduring elements of this tragedy was the famous painting entitled The Raft of the Medusa, painted by the French artist Théodore Géricault in 1819. This oil on canvas, almost 5 meters high and more than 7 meters wide, has become one of the most iconic representations of human suffering in the history of art. Géricault was inspired by the survivors' accounts and his own research to create a work that captured the horror, despair, and heroism of those left on the raft. His painting was first exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1819 and made a great impact on critics and the public. Captain Chaumares was court-martialed for his responsibility in the Medusa tragedy. During the trial, it became clear that his negligence and lack of experience had been decisive factors in the shipwreck and the subsequent tragedy. He was found guilty of incompetence and abandonment of his men and sentenced to 3 years in prison, which was considered by many to be too light a sentence for the magnitude of his mistakes. The tragedy of the Medusa left an indelible mark on the history of France and on the collective memory of Europe. This disaster not only exposed the horrors of exploration and the challenges of the sea, but also highlighted the deep social and political divide of the time. On a symbolic level, the frigate Medusa became a symbol of leadership failures and the catastrophic consequences that can arise from incompetence in crisis situations. In short, the expedition of the frigate Medusa in 1816 is a dark chapter in the history of French exploration and politics. What began as a mission to reassert French colonial rule in Senegal ended in a tragedy that exposed the weaknesses of the Bourbon Restoration and left an indelible mark on the history of human survival. This story is a warning about the dangers of negligence, lack of preparation, and corruption in leadership. Thank you for joining us. If you liked the episode, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell for more revealing stories in Untold Story. See you in the next one.